Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back once again to Samuel Adams Returns. Those Anti-Federalists, they did. They absolutely got it right. And this is your host, Tom Navolis. And I am delighted to be here with you again. I want to remind you right from the beginning, because otherwise I'll forget, is that you can get all the archives of this program at samueladamsreturns.net. And everything's there. All of the information, all the references are all there as well. So, and what I need your help with is to get folks to sign up for the promo. I'm not putting out a lot of stuff, but if you think that this programming does have value, we sure could use some more folks getting educated. Getting educated. And why is that? Well, here it is. It's very simple. I started to put this program together today from a point of view, not a culture war. That, we're hearing this, not a culture war, or it is a culture war. Culture war this, culture war that. All of this stuff going on. It's a culture war. No, I will say very, very clearly, we have been for many years, and we are within a revolution. The revolution, as we really watch the press, and those that have any understanding of constitutionalism, any understanding of the truth that we're going to talk about from the Anti-Federalists today, because remember, that's what this program is Samuel Adams. He returns because we need him today and his principles of our founding fathers. And the Anti-Federalists got it right. Those Anti-Federalists nailed it. So we're going to talk about the revolution from the perspective that because we fought that revolution, we won the whole idea for liberty, and then as we were putting the Constitution in place, or our predecessors were putting the Constitution in place, there were things about it that in many ways made sense, but in so many other ways, the Anti-Federalists said, no, time out. So quite frankly, what we're seeing with the Jerry Nadlers, what we're seeing with the Pelosi's, what we're seeing with the Schumers, what we're seeing with the tyranny, despotism, and traitorous FBI people that were there at the top of the FBI, not a lot of the people working hard within the FBI, what we're seeing with the Clintons, what we're seeing with and the list can just go on. Many of the Democrats are because, yes, the Anti-Federalists predicted it. But the because is, I want to reference something really quick before I get into the other meat, is that the revolution that is happening now started, I guess, before creation of mankind. And I would always take it back to the battle within the context of what was happening in heaven and Satan getting tossed out with a third of the heavenly host. That means 2/3 of the heavenly host are still there, which is a good thing. But that third that got trounced out and thrown out, who are trying to make themselves as God, you know what? That's what's happening within the context of all these other people. It's a power struggle. It's about taking and trying to make themselves or people, us, any of us, a lot of times trying to make ourselves as God. So what I wanted to do is circle back to an article a few weeks ago. I did it on, it was Christianity and Culture by J. Gresham Machen, and he put this into the Princeton Theological Review in 1913. And I didn't get a real chance to finish it up with you, but one of the things that I wanted to look at when we're seeing all of these very definitive attacks in morality, in a state legislator, and attacking even a woman outside of a abortion clinic where she was praying in protest of murdering unborn, just getting into her face and all of that type of stuff. But even more so, we're seeing that it has been an attack since the mid-60s, if you will, and before, but in the mid-60s when God was thrown out of schools. So what I've been seeing as I sit on this particular board that I'm on, the mental health board, that everything is the students, it's all about mental health. The students need help mentally. And we see this again in the Chicago shooting is, oh, it was bullying. It was all, not Chicago, I meant Colorado, so excuse me. Colorado shooting, oh, it was about bullying that these people went, over the edge. Well, going over the edge in so many ways, when I sit and I listen to all the different issues that are out there that are being diagnosed as mental health, quite frankly, I see them, as issues that are moral issues. They're issues because when you throw God out of society, when you throw him out of the schools, when you throw him out of the political arena, decision-making arena, when you throw him out of the corporate offices, you get what we have today, all right? We've seen it over and over. Anybody that really pays attention, and this is the antinomians don't, is that if you really pay attention, is that the Old Testament is full of those examples of society, education, and political authorities and religious authorities throwing God out. So, with that, one of the things that our author here, Mr. Macon, was writing that I think is very interesting. He says, in the first place, I do not mean that most reject Christianity consciously on account of intellectual difficulties. On the contrary, rejection of Christianity is due to the vast majority of cases simply to indifference. Only a few men have given the subject real attention. The vast majority of those who reject the gospel do so simply because they know nothing about it. But whence it comes, this indifference? Where does it come from? It is due to intellectual atmosphere in which men are living. The modern world is dominated by ideas which ignore the gospel. Modern culture is not altogether opposed to the gospel, but it is out of all connection with it. It not only prevents the acceptance of Christianity, it prevents Christianity even from getting a hearing. I thought that is so telling in what is happening in the political environment on college campuses, what's happened for years since the mid-60s in the public school arena, and in the universities now, just not the public school universities, as I talked about last week in Sam Adams' thesis, but in those private schools, in the Christian biblical schools, in the Multnomah colleges even, the Bible colleges, and Catholic universities. We're seeing that the gospel, the truth of Christ, is no longer welcome there. And that it is the indifference and it is these intellectuals that are actually driving those truths out. So do you call that a culture war? No, I call it a civil war. Civil war that started in heaven and has been continuing on earth. But what we forget is that no different than the war that happened to set America free from England, the war is won. And the war is won when it's taken into that perspective of what happened at the cross and definitely what happened within the context of the resurrection. But a lot of places, a lot of churches just don't want to talk about it, so it becomes an intellectual nothing, if you will. It becomes a place where the meaninglessness of what Christianity has to offer becomes then the intolerance of those who jump up and down and claim tolerance. So where does that go? It goes to what I really wanted to talk about in today's program, and we're going to move on to it in the next couple of segments, is that the real civil war is about power. The real civil war is about that whole control mechanism. I think those are some of the things that have always originated from the father of lies, is how to control the human race and how to have power over not just the whole human race, but over everything that is under creation. But how does that fit when we're talking about the anti-federalists and what's happened from that early arguments of the Constitution? We're going to look at two different arguments. One argument we're going to look at was on the 6th, June 27th, actually, in 1787, Luther Martin's objection. And all of that objection, which was actually put into perspective by Robert Yates, because Luther Martin's speech was so rambling. You know, if I continued the way that I'd continue, I'd probably ramble as well. But it was so rambling that to bring continuity to it, Yates summarized it. And we're going to talk about some of those issues on that summary in regard to why the Constitution of 87 was kind of a bad idea, and how those that have studied the Anti-Federalist Papers in particular know how to take apart the Constitution. And all of the warnings that were given by the Anti-Federalists are true. We're seeing it. We're seeing it in the Democrats and their actions and everything that they're doing. We were warned about. And that's very, very difficult to swallow. The other one that we're going to be talking about is the Pennsylvania minority. And that was also a follow-up to the convention, both the Pennsylvania ratifying convention and the Convention of 87 relative to what happened there and the Constitution. That's going to have some interesting warnings buried within it. And it's not buried, if you will. They're right there in plain sight for anyone to read and learn from and apply. But where I want to finish in what, last 2 minutes, Kath, is what I have, basically? 2.5. In these last 2 minutes, what I want to finish with is that the Democrats, in where they are, to some extent, are because they have been, sadly, not given a good education. They are the embodiment of this educational system, which has removed from it not only the concepts of biblical truth, the basics of the Ten Commandments, but these founding principles upon which the Federalists were saying we could hold true to. But the Anti-Federalists said because of these issues of mankind in the lust for power, the desires for control, the means and abilities to form cabals, that we're going to have problems. We're going to have problems with this Constitution. And we're going to have problems in what that means into future generations, which we're seeing right now. We're seeing it because what the founders, especially the Anti-Federalists, and Sam Adams in particular, were saying is that utopianism is unconstitutional. Utopianism, that being Marxism, socialism, all of that, is evil, all right? And that the educational system has failed everyone, and especially those poor Democrats and all those kids that are running around out there on campuses and pushing over signs and pushing over all of the things on relative to people who want to stand up for truth, who want to stand up for the Constitution, and actually taking and bringing violence against them. And that's because our educational system has perverted it. And as we read earlier, that the intellectuals, and I'm looking again at my Thomas Sowell Intellectuals in Society book in front of me, have taken and perverted truth for their own personal gain. But Sam Adams and the Anti-Federalists knew what was right, So come on back for the second segment because they'll bring you the truth. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to this second segment of Samuel Adams Returns. Those anti-federalists, they got it right. And as we look into the mirrors of history, we are going to delve into what I mentioned in the first segment, is that on Luther Martin's objections that were summarized by Robert Yates and the Pennsylvania minority in what they were writing. But as always, and sometimes I do miss it because I have so much that I'm trying to pack in here, is that I want you to listen, those that are listening on the radio, to take and look at libertyworksradionetwork.com or lwrn.net and check out the other programming. Good stuff here. And please, as always, look at what some of the other folks are doing. Join the live programming during the week. And as you can, remember that donate button. It's there, listener-funded network. And we really, really appreciate everything that you're doing. And with that, if you would take and go to samueladamsreturns.net, you can take and find all the archives of the program there, as well as you can find the books there. The books are, I'm pointing back behind me on the bookshelf, my two books. And as I mentioned, I'll be delving in and putting research together right now to write another book on Sam Adams' education, if you will, his thesis, how did that really come about, the fundamentals of all the principles engaged in what we're talking about right now. And what we're talking about is that everything that we're seeing happening in especially the Democrat side of government, and in all of the, people want to call them liberals, I just want to call them baked socialist, and in some cases communist, in the bureaucracies, whether it's at the federal level or whether it's down all the way into the states and your local government, is because, as we mentioned earlier, the educational system has cheated these people of truth. And part of that cheating also is what I mentioned from the article that we opened up with from the Princeton paper, the Christianity and Culture, that was in the Princeton Theological Review. Intellectualism can take and destroy the truths and principles. I guess that's why Jesus said, be like a child, because when you think you're smarter than everybody else and you think you're an intellectual and you can banter and chit-chat and take on the world with your smartness, well, not really. Usually people take and they fool themselves. Anyway, let's get on with it. Control and power. As I said, this isn't a culture war. What this really is that civil war. We are in a civil war right now. And the Democrats are after, where I went from this whole idea of culture to civil war, is control and power. So when I was trying to put everything together today, I just was starting in the Anti-Federalist papers and doing a word search, if you will, on control. And then I went, oh my goodness, it ties into power. And every one of the over 150 plus Anti-Federalist papers that I personally have, and remember there's 7 volumes of those, and I don't have all 7 volumes. Maybe someday if you help me and buy enough of my books, I can get rich and famous enough to go buy those 7 volumes, because I'd really love to have them and get into all of them. But we're going to go with an innocuous one, if you will, summarized by none other than my good friend Mr. Yates, who was a pseudonym Brutus in his other writings, on this Luther Martin's objections. And what he was talking about here was the Virginia plan, and how that Virginia plan, what it did to bring an unequal confederation, and how unequal power would be established. And what was most important is that the Virginia plan would really obviate the states. And it was like, my goodness gracious, if you executed this, the legislature would become at all almost kind of like it is today, a little bit, except for we're going to talk about why Donald Trump got elected because, quite frankly, it's predicted. It is predicted. But I think I have that here as where Trump gets elected was more predicted by the Pennsylvania minority. So we may not get that until the third segment. But interestingly enough, these people knew history very well. They knew ancient history. They knew what was going on with the Greeks. They knew what was going on with the Romans. So the kids don't study that anymore. They barely study American history from the foundational period. They're really starting after the Civil War. And sometimes at the Civil War around slavery and things of that nature instead of getting down to what drove us to liberty. What brought that about. So what he got into here is he's talking about the Lacedaemonians insisted that Amphitrite council to exclude some of the smaller states from a right to vote in order that they may tyrannize over them. If the plan now on the table be adopted, 3 states in the Union have the control and they may make use of their power when they please. Now, what caught me about that is that the arguments right now about the Electoral College, excuse my stuttering, but the Electoral College issue is exactly similar. Is that now we have New York and California and maybe a couple other states combined, or we can say the left coast for sure with Washington, Oregon, and California. And then we get into the messed up Massachusetts, Connecticut, New York, and all of the rest of those northeastern states, even into the never again Jersey, that have taken, and they have such a population base, being the larger states, and that's what was mentioned here in the whole context of these arguments, the larger states being those with the greater population, can control everything. So we need the Electoral College because they're talking about that the states, 3 states in this case, and I just stated the other, they can have control. And they can use their power when they please. They could tyrannize over everybody else. And because that's where the demons are, the socialist communists are in our modern time, again, the mirrors of history are very reflective. And what we're seeing is that nothing new under the sun. So if there exists no separate interest, there is no danger of equality of votes. And if there be a danger, the smaller states cannot yield. If the foundation of the existing confederation under the Articles of Confederation is well laid, powers may be added. That was the argument, was to fix the Articles of Confederation, which I think there were a lot of good things in there. I always do, and I always will. But you may say, safely, add a 3rd story to the house where the foundation is good. Read then the votes and proceedings of Congress on forming the Confederation. What happened during that time? Those are the types of studies that we don't do any longer. To understand the fundamental principles of good governance has to take us back into the Confederation, the Articles of Confederation. And what was it? It was about states' rights, states being independent republics that confederated together to have a national environment for certain effects. But the warnings are here as to what's going on and what would happen as we're seeing it today, where in essence, the states are obviated. They're destroyed by what's happened from the federal legislature. And those that get elected into Congress and those that are these lifetime lifers in the Senate, in both the House and the Senate, they are only about power and control, which we're going to talk about, and the perversion. And anyway, we'll let these guys speak. I'm not going to get like some of the other pundits out there. So anyway, the partial representation in Congress is know the cause of its weakness, but the want of power. So, what he was talking about, and this is what was very, very important in the Articles of Confederation, is that the representation that they felt was happening in Congress, and that maybe it wasn't sufficient, maybe, and others argued that it was. The minority, the Pennsylvania minority, argued that right now, under this Constitution, it's not sufficient. But it had nothing to do about representation, had everything to do about power. I would not trust a government organized upon the report plan for all the slaves of Carolina or the horses and oxen of Massachusetts. Price says that laws made by one man or a set of men and not by common consent is slavery. And it is so when applied to the states. If you give them an unequal representation, what are called human feelings, in this instance, are only the feelings of ambition and the lust for power. So when we're looking at everything that's out there and everybody talking about feelings, and now Congress wants, and Pelosi with her, what do you call it, her HB5 and all that, about the feelings, and we have to, take care of all, and the feelings, it's not about feelings. He lays it out right here. It's about the lust for power. Lust for power. So I tried to capture a couple things real quick. Is that one, is that the basis of all ancient and modern confederations is the freedom and independency of the states composing it. Do you think that your state is really free? Do you think it's really independent? Do you think that it is not layered into and hooked into because of all the federal monies that we're taxed upon? Well, guess what? We're not independent. We're not independent. And it was about the ambition and power of the great Grecian states, which at last ruined this respectable council. He gets into what the council is. You have to go look at the notes that I have in the reference section. It all drives back again to usurpation of the whole power of the Helvetic Confederacy, but she is consistent still with being equal. And what he was talking about in there is that, it broke apart in Greece because of the lust of power. So here we have the second point. I would rather confederate with a single state than submit to the Virginia plan, obviously. But we are already confederated, and no power on earth can dissolve it but the consent of the contracting powers. So much that I could talk about. And I do have it in the second book up there from, that just talks about what is it from a confederation, what is it on the contracting powers. And I'm running out of time, so that's why I'm slipping. You're going to have to go look up on SamuelAdamsReturns.net what book I'm talking about. But anyway, it gets into that. There's so much to talk about there. And that the confederation that was in place under the Articles of Confederation were pretty darn good. And it represented the states. And then Yates summarizes everything regarding Luther Martin's objections in that this general government, I believe, is the first upon the earth which gives checks against democracies or aristocracies. The only necessary check in general government ought to be to retain and prevent it absorbing the powers of the state government. See, that's what the federal government should be about. Representation on federal principles can only flow from state societies. Representation and taxation are ever inseparable, not according to the quantum of property, but the quantum of freedom. So the purpose of a confederation, the purpose of a federal government is to ensure that the states remain free, independent republics, and that only come together for those that, as we teach, and you can learn and you can hear from others, have limited powers. But that's not where we're at today. And we're going to talk about the predictions in the final segment in a few minutes. But where we are today is a real need of the principles of Samuel Adams returning, and that everyone get educated in the truths and principles of the Anti-Federalists, because you know they did. You know they absolutely got it right. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to this third and final segment of Samuel Adams Returns. Those Anti-Federalists, they did. They got it right. And what I'd like you to do is I want to remind you, if you would go to last week and go watch the video, and you can even go all the way through to the end of the video. But what I'd like you to do is take a look at the promos there for Liberty Camp Geauga, and that is coming up in the last week of July. So please check that out. And as well, I have there that the Go Therefore 2019 conference, that's July 26th and 27th at the University of Northwestern Ohio. Go there. Go Therefore conference.com and check that out and look at the promo at the end of last week's program as well. So let's just jump right back into where we are with the Pennsylvania minority. I got to tell you, they nailed it. It's a very long rebuttal to a lot of what was happening coming out of convention regarding this whole Constitution, regarding everything that we're seeing today. It just was phenomenal. So he comes back, and these writers, as they put this together, there were several of them that contributed to this, is that they entertain the truth of the foregoing principle. It has been fully removed by the concessions of Mr. Wilson. And remember, Mr. Wilson, and I've read all of his commentaries on the Constitution, Wilson's commentaries on the Constitution. He's a strong Federalist. I got to tell you, you know, he would be like some of the Congress people today that are saying, yeah, our real purpose there is to impeach Trump. Well, their real purpose in the strong Federalists was to take and obviate the states and become a centralized government. Wilson was one of those guys. He was up for it. You know, he was kind of soft, but he was up for it. Anyway, one of the majorities on this question, and who was one of the deputies in the late General Convention. In justice to him, we will give his own words. They are as follow. Quote, the extent of country for which the new Constitution was required produced another difficulty in the business of the Federal Convention. It is the opinion of some celebrated writers that to a small territory, the democratical, and to the middling territory, as Montesquieu has termed it, the monarchical, and to the extensive territory, the despotic form of government is best adapted. Regarding, then, the wide and almost unbound jurisdiction of the United States, at first view, the hand of despotism seemed necessary to control. There's that control again. Connect and protect it. And hence the chief embarrassment rose. For we know that although our constituents would cheerfully submit to the legislative restraints of a free government, they would spurn at every attempt to shackle them with a despotic power. So there's that control and power thing that I was talking about way back in the first segment in regards to a civil war. And that's the end of that quote. Again, in another part of his speech, he continues, and this is Wilson continuing, quote, is it probable that the dissolution of the state governments and the establishment of one consolidated empire would be eligible in its nature and satisfactory to the people in its administration? I think not, as I have given reasons to show that so extensive a territory could not be governed, connected, and preserved by the supremacy of despotic power. All the exertions of the most potent emperors of Rome were not capable of keeping the empire together, which in extent was far inferior to the dominion of America. End quote. We dissent, secondly, because the powers vested in Congress by this Constitution must be, and this is now the Pennsylvania minority, and they're dissenting because the powers vested in Congress by this Constitution must necessarily annihilate and absorb the legislative, executive, and judicial powers of the several states and produce from their ruin one consolidated government, which, from the nature of things, will be an iron-handed despotism, as nothing short of the supremacy of despotic sway could connect and govern these United States under one government. So they were kind of letting Wilson kind of drag it around and make the argument that, well, if you have a small state type thing, you can go ahead and you can get away with the idea that small territories can be democratical. You can have the middling sized territory as monarchical. And then if you're going to have something expansive, you definitely have to have a despotic form of government. But then he kind of twists it and he goes, I don't think the people could really tolerate that. I don't think that they would put up with it, especially after going through the war that we went through at that time. And yet, he lays the groundwork. And when you read the commentaries and his commentaries on the Constitution, there's areas in there where he actually lays that framework for consolidated government. And this then is where the Pennsylvania minority steps in and says, stop. We gave Wilson a chance to, kind of back this down a little bit. And he did. He backed it down a little bit. But when you go into the whole aspect and truths of the Constitution, as written, as executed, as what would happen by virtue of the actions of Congress, we would end up with a consolidated form of government, usurping the states in so many different ways, especially with the judicial powers. And we're seeing that. I mean, that's what we have today. That's why it's very important. Who's on the Supreme Court? What do they really, really know and understand from their judicial theory? You have to understand the judicial theory. What does it mean to be, constructionist? What does it mean to be originalist? Those are very, very critical. Otherwise, you have these people who they believe in this Constitution that is continually changing and framing according to the feelings of society. Wow. Anyway, here's where we get into the whole point on Trump. So we get in here and they're talking about to establish the truth of this position, a cursory investigation of the principles and form of this Constitution will suffice. So they start driving through the principles. And this goes again to what I was saying in the first and second segment, is that we don't teach principles in school any longer. We don't teach how to think through the original concepts of principles and truths. So the first consideration that this review suggests is the omission of a Bill of Rights. Well, we ended up getting a Bill of Rights because these guys and the other folks in Virginia and Massachusetts and the Anti-federalists in general fought for a Bill of Rights. They fought for that Bill of Rights. But the fundamentals, asserting and fundamentally establishing those unalienable rights and personal rights of men without the full, and they mean mankind, okay? So don't go hacking around with the word men, means mankind, without the full, free, and secure enjoyment of which there can be no liberty, and over which it is not necessary for a good government to have any control. So when we're being attacked in free speech, when we're being attacked in our religious liberties, when we're being attacked in everything that is reserved to we the people within the Bill of Rights, including our Second Amendment, guess what? A good government would have no control over that. But what we have is a bad government in many ways, because there's bad, immoral people, corrupt people, the principle of which are the rights of conscience, personal liberty, by the clear and unequivocal establishment of a writ of habeas corpus, jury trials in criminal law and civil cases, by an impartial jury of the people in the local area or in the county, with the common law proceeding. And common law proceedings, okay? We got away from common law. Now they have all this precedent and all this other nonsense that they go with. For the safety meaning how you take care of that, of the accused in criminal prosecutions, and then the liberty of the press, and that scourge of tyrants, which is the liberty of the press, but now the press is so corrupt, and the grand bulwark of every other liberty and privilege. The stipulation, therefore, made in favor of them in the state constitutions are entirely superseded by this Constitution. So you have to go back and understand the original 13 colonies that became states and what's in their original constitutions, because right now Massachusetts and all the others are so perverted by amendment. It's terrible. Yeah, anyway. So we only have 5 minutes, and I want to get into why did Trump get elected? And the answer here is given by the Pennsylvania minority. The Pennsylvania minority, there was a whole section here that I'm jumping through, and I'm going to summarize for you. Thus it appears that the liberties, happiness, interests, and great concerns of the whole United States may be dependent upon the integrity, virtue, wisdom, and knowledge of 25 or 26 men. And that being those in Congress at the time. You know, what was the representation? Now it's the 400 plus yo-yos that are bouncing on the strings. Anyway, let's get in here. How adequate and unsafe representation? Inadequate because the sense and views of the 300 million of the people are diffused over so extensive of a territory comprising various climate, products, habits, interests, and opinions cannot be collected in so small a body. So this goes into we don't have enough proper representation, and these 400 clowns that we have now do whatever they damn well please. All right. So let's get into what he talks about here. So it's not fair. And equal representation of people, even in the proportion to its number, for the smallest state has as much weight as in the Senate as the largest state from the smallest number to be chosen on both branches of the legislature. So here's where it goes. Let's push on. And from the mode of election and appointment, which is under the control of Congress. And from the nature of things, men of the most elevated rank in life will alone be chosen. Get that. And the other orders in the society, such as farmers, traders, mechanics, who all ought to have a competent number of their best informed men in the legislature, will be totally unrepresented. Trump says, I represent the forgotten man. I represent the farmers, the traders, the mechanics, all those who expect to have competent members in Congress, in the House and the Senate, don't have that because of the different perversions that are there. That's why Trump got elected, right there. That was written way back in 1788. Wow. Isn't that amazing? Well, in my notes, which you can download the PDF in the notes, I have several warnings. I have 3 major warnings. One of the warnings that really is important here is that representation is unsafe because in the exercise of such great powers and trust, it is so exposed to corruption and undue influence by the gift of the numerous places of honor and emulance at the disposal of the executive by the arts and address of the great and designing, and by direct bribery. So how is it that someone goes into Congress in debt because of what they owe for everything that they had to put into running for the House of Representatives or the Senate? They're in debt, $1 million or $2. How is it then that they become millionaires? How is that? That's a warning that was given us back then, is because of all of that. It is because of that great power and the corruption that goes to that. And, they're talking about the arts and not being painting arts, but the arts of deception and cabal. Oh, they're called lobbyists. So how do we wrap this up in the last half minute? Folks, you have to get educated. You have to learn this stuff. You have to attend one of my seminars. Go read the notes, if nothing else. That's your call to action for this week is to understand just what these notes are saying and what these three critical warnings are. And I think then you'll be more educated than those that are sitting in Congress. So come on back next week when who? Sam Adams, he returns. And yes, those anti-federalists, they did. They absolutely got it right.